The arrow hit the town gate post 6 inches from Elijah Weston's ear, and the woman who fired it stepped out of the blizzard with a short bow still drawn. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and furious. Green-skinned with the deep undertone of pine bark in winter, she wore snug dark travel leathers, a fitted vest laced tight across a powerful chest, a cinched belt holding twin sheaths at her hips, and close-fitting breeches tucked into heavy fur-lined boots. Her black hair was shorn close on the sides and braided back from the crown, in a single warrior's plait that swung like a rope when she moved. Her jaw was strong, her lower canines barely showing as she spoke, and her amber eyes were lit with something that was not fear but was very close to rage. "Open the gate," she said, "or the next one finds your throat." Elijah did not move for a full second. He had been a sellsword for 9 years, long enough to know the difference between a bluff and a promise. The way she held that bow elbow level, string still taut, that was a promise. "I don't control the gate," he said carefully. "You were talking to the man who does. Half a minute ago, I watched from the tree line." Snow drove sideways across the open ground between Harrowfen's outer wall and the dark mass of the Valdreth forest. Behind the woman, somewhere in that dark, the army of General Crassus Vane had been camped for 11 days, a force of 3,000 mercenaries hired by the eastern barons to take Harrowfen's grain stores before winter settled in for good. The town had less than 400 able bodies inside its walls, and Elijah had arrived 2 days ago with nothing to offer them but his orchard-calloused hands and a blade he had almost forgotten how to use. "Come closer to the light," he said. "If you come in range of the gate archers looking like that, they'll shoot you before I can say a word." She studied him. The wind screamed between them. Then, with a precision that spoke of someone who did not waste motion, she released the tension on the bowstring and lowered the weapon. "Talk fast," she said. He took 3 steps toward her, away from the gate's torch pool and into the dark where neither the gate captain nor the wall archers could see them clearly. Snow pelted his face. She was close enough now that he could see the ice crystals forming on her lashes. "You're not with Vane," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am not." "Then, what are you doing outside a besieged town in the middle of a blizzard?" "Trying to get inside it," she said, "before the thing in the forest decides I'm easier prey than the cattle Vane's men have penned beyond his camp." That stopped him. "What thing?" Her jaw tightened. "Something that killed 4 of Vane's picket soldiers last night and left nothing but their boots. Something that has been following me for 2 days out of the Greymarsh Hills." She held his gaze without flinching. "I am not accustomed to being frightened. I am currently frightened." Elijah Weston turned and hammered on the gate with his fist. The gate captain, a broad-bellied man named Forel, was predictably hostile when the torchlight showed him what Elijah had dragged inside. "That's an orc," Forel said, as if Elijah might have missed it. "She is an orc," Elijah agreed. "And she brings information about whatever is hunting in the forest, which is relevant to us since our situation is already desperate enough without a monster in the tree line. We don't take orcs inside the wall." "Town charter says." "The town charter," said the orc woman, cutting across Forel with a voice like a drawn blade, "was written 40 years ago when your founding council wanted an excuse to keep orc traders from undercutting your market prices. I've read it. I have, in fact, read most of your regional statutes, which is more than I suspect you have." She looked at Forel without a trace of softness. "I am Murbul Ironhide, authorized assessor of the Greycrown Trading Compact. I carry documentation which I will happily show you once I am standing somewhere that is not a howling blizzard." Forel looked at Elijah. Elijah shrugged. "She had an arrow at my throat 2 minutes ago and she still hasn't killed me. I'm inclined to trust her." The gate captain grumbled, but he stepped aside. Harrowfen's interior was a warren of stone and timber buildings pressed close together against the outer wall, all of them dark except for a central tavern called the Copper Bell, which served as the town's command post, shelter overflow, and the only place still selling hot food. Elijah brought Murbul there, pushed open the low-beamed door, and felt the warmth of the fire hit him like a thrown blanket. The room went quiet the way rooms always went quiet when an orc walked in. Murbul did not slow her stride or lower her eyes. She walked to the fire, stood with her back to the hearth, and looked around the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who had survived worse disapproval than this. Elijah dropped into the chair across the nearest table and looked at her. The firelight turned her green skin to something warmer, like deep water in afternoon sun. She was, he realized with some surprise, genuinely striking, not despite the breadth of her shoulders or the hard line of her jaw, but because of all of it together, the way a sword is beautiful because of what it is. "Murbul Ironhide," he said. "I'm Elijah Weston. I used to do what the gate captain thinks I still do, which is carry a sword for money. Now I grow apple trees about 20 miles east of here." She looked at him. "You came back to fight." "I came back because Mayor Dunvan sent a rider and she's known me since I was a boy." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm not sure she made a wise choice." "You got me through the gate," Murbul said. "That's one useful thing already." The Copperbell's keeper, a nervous woman named Sella, brought 2 bowls of lentil soup without being asked, looked at Murbul, decided against any comment, and retreated behind her counter. Murbul sat, pulled the bowl toward her, and ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had not had a hot meal in longer than they intended to admit. Elijah watched her for a moment and then ate too. When the bowls were empty, she told him about the creature. She had been traveling from Greymarsh to Harrowfen alone, following a trade route through the Highlands, carrying a case of contract documents from the Compact's eastern office. The route took her through a narrow-shouldered valley called the Spine Pass, where the trail wound between 2 ridges thick with old-growth fir. On the second night she had heard something moving in the dark, something too large for a wolf, too deliberate for a bear. She had built her fire high and kept her bow across her knees. At dawn she found the track, 3-toed, each print the width of 2 hands side by side, pressing into frozen ground deep enough to suggest a weight that a normal predator should not have. "Greymaw," said an old man sitting 2 tables away. He had been pretending not to listen but apparently gave up the pretense. He had a white beard and the deliberate stillness of someone who had once known something frightening and never stopped knowing it. "That's a greymaw print. 3 toes heavy. They come down out of the deep Greymarsh in hard winters when the elk move south and the hunting thins out." "What is a greymaw?" Elijah asked. "Something like a bear if a bear had opinions," the old man said. "Longer, lower, smarter. Not magical exactly, but they think, they plan. And they don't give up once they've decided something is their prey." He looked at Murbul with unexpected directness. "You said it killed 4 of Vane's soldiers." "That I know of," Murbul said. "There may be more I don't know of." The old man nodded slowly. "Vane's going to have problems. An army camped in a forest in winter with a greymaw loose. That animal will pick them apart at the edges until they panic or pull back. The siege might break itself if the beast keeps at them." Elijah felt something turn over in his mind, a possibility, an unpleasant one because it involved going back out into that blizzard. Murbul looked at him and he could see, with a small shock, that she was thinking the same thing. "The beast needs to be dealt with regardless," she said. "A greymaw that has killed soldiers is a greymaw that has learned humans are prey. When Vane's army is gone, it won't suddenly stop hunting. It will come to your walls next." "She's right," Elijah said to the room, because Forel had come in from the cold and was dripping at the door and apparently thought he should be part of any conversation about the town's strategic situation. "We don't have the hunters for it," Forel said. "We've got farmers and a handful of my gate guards." "I have done this before," Murbul said quietly. Everyone looked at her. She met their eyes one at a time without embarrassment. "Orc clan territories border greymaw country in the Highland East. When I was young, our clan lost 3 herds to a greymaw over one winter. My father led the hunt that killed it. I was part of that hunt." She paused. "I am not young anymore and my father is dead, but I remember what it takes." The silence in the Copperbell was different now, not the hostile silence from when she'd walked in. Something more careful than that. "What does it take?" Elijah asked. She looked at him and for a moment the amber eyes were completely unguarded. 2 people minimum, 1 to drive, 1 to hold the line. The animal panics when flanked. It will charge the holder, which is the more dangerous position. You need someone who can hold very still under pressure and hit a moving target at close range. She glanced at his hands on the table. Those aren't orchard calluses on your right hand. He looked down. She was right. The outer edge of his palm, the grip ridges of his sword hand, were different from the blister thickenings of axe and shovel work. Old and faded, but there. Former sellsword, he said. Can you hold a line? He thought about it honestly rather than just saying yes. Yes. Then we can do this, Murbul said. She sounded certain without sounding arrogant, which was a specific and useful distinction. They argued for another 2 hours with Forel, with the mayor who was sent for, with 3 of the town elders who arrived in various states of night clothes. Nobody loved the plan. Several people pointed out at volume that sending the only 2 people willing to do this thing out into a blizzard in the dark was not a military strategy but a sentence. The mayor, a compact gray-haired woman named Aldis Dunving, who had known Elijah Weston since he was a child running barefoot through her market, looked at him with the expression of someone who had always suspected he would do something like this. "You're sure," she said. "It wasn't quite a question. If we drive Vane's siege with this thing at the same time," Elijah said, "there may not be a Harrowfen left to hold out." Aldis looked at Murbul with the careful assessment of someone who had survived 4 decades of hard border politics. "You," she said, "you came here alone, an orc assessor alone in the middle of a siege. Why?" Murbul was quiet for a moment. "Because the Compact's contract with Harrowfen is the only reason your eastern grain farmers have trade protections this side of the mountains. If Vane takes Harrowfen, those protections dissolve. That matters to 17 orc clan families who sell wool and copper through your market." She held the mayor's gaze. "We have shared interests. We have had them for years. I am tired of the fact that no one in this town appears to know it." Aldis Dunvin was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you need?" They geared up before dawn because the blizzard was still raging, and Murbul said the graymaw would be moving in it rather than sheltered from it. The animal hunted by smell, not sight, and a blizzard was simply wind, which meant information about where prey was upwind. She strung her shortbow fresh and chose her heaviest broadhead arrows from the quiver she'd carried in. Elijah dug through the town armory, which was mostly rusted agricultural implements and 2 functional crossbows, and found a short sword that was at least balanced correctly. He strapped it on with the muscle memory of years. He also took his heavy woolen campaign cloak from his pack. It was not a fine thing dyed brown with age, thick as a horse blanket, big enough to serve as a ground cover when he slept rough. He had owned it since his first year as a sellsword, and it had done everything a cloak could be asked to do. They went out through the East Sally port, which opened on the opposite side of the wall from Vane's encampment. The night outside was a wall of white and howling. The temperature had dropped since she'd arrived, and the snow drove horizontally now, fine and vicious. Murbul led because she knew the track. She had noted where she'd lost the Greymaw's trail before she'd made it to the gate, and she had an uncanny geographic memory that she mentioned without pride, simply as a relevant fact. Elijah walked at her shoulder. They could not speak above the wind, so they did not try. He watched the way she moved through the dark and the snow, deliberate, unhurried, conserving heat, reading the ground through her boots. She was extraordinary, and she probably had no idea he was thinking it. After an hour of hard going through the forest's outer fringe, she stopped and crouched. He crouched beside her. She pointed. He could barely see what she was indicating, a broken branch, a disturbance in the snow at the base of a spruce where something had rested or paused or leaned. She touched the ground beside it with a bare hand despite the cold, reading temperature, reading how much snow had settled into the impression. "Recent," she said against his ear. Her breath was warm. "Moving northwest." He nodded. She turned her head, and their faces were very close, and she looked at him for just a moment with something that was not the hunting assessment of the last hour. Just looking. Then she was moving again. They found the graymaw at the edge of a frozen stream bed, 2 miles into the forest, just as the sky began to separate from complete black into deep blue-gray. Elijah heard it first, a low, wet, rhythmic sound that was not wind and not the creek. He touched Murbul's arm without thinking, and she stopped instantly. The graymaw was at the bank, its back to them, working at something in the ice. It was massive, lower than a bear. He had been told, and it was true, its shoulder only waist-high on him. But it was long, so long, and the muscles of its back and hindquarters were roped and enormous under a coat of gray-brown fur. Its head, when it turned to scent the air, was broad and blunt-snouted, with small pale eyes set wide and forward-looking, which was the thing that made it different from any animal it resembled. Forward-looking eyes. Predator eyes, thinking eyes. It had not caught their scent yet. The wind was in their faces, blowing toward the creek. Murbul put her mouth against his ear, her hand light on his shoulder. "You go wide to the right, 20 paces. When I signal a single low whistle, you break cover and shout. Whatever you have to do to make noise, drive it toward me. That means it charges you," he breathed. "Yes." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "I have done this before." "Not alone, you haven't." Her expression shifted, something complicated, not quite a smile but close. "No," she agreed. "Not alone. That is why I need you on the right." He went wide to the right, moving with all the quiet his 9 years of sellsword work had bought him. The snow helped, his footfalls were muffled. He counted 20 paces, found a wide spruce trunk, pressed his back to it, hand on the short sword's grip but not drawing yet. He looked across the distance to where he'd left her. He couldn't see her. She had simply disappeared into the snow and dark. He breathed. He waited. The low whistle came. Elijah stepped out from behind the spruce and shouted, not words, just sound, raw and loud, and he beat his hand against the spruce trunk 3 times, the crack of it punching through the wind. The graymaw spun with a speed that shocked him. That enormous body whipping around, those pale eyes locking onto him across the distance. For a full second it was absolutely still, and in that second Elijah Weston, former sellsword, apple orchardist, ordinary man of no particular distinction, thought with crystalline clarity that he had made a significant error. Then the first arrow hit the graymaw in the left haunch, and the animal wheeled toward its source. 3 arrows in rapid succession, each landing in the flank, each driving it further around, and then the animal was running at where Murbul had been, not where she was, because she had moved, rolling sideways in the snow as the graymaw's momentum carried it past her. And as it crashed through the brush beyond and turned for another charge, she was upright, bow at full draw, and the 4th arrow went into its throat. The graymaw screamed. Elijah had his sword out by then, which was probably useless, but his body had made the decision before his mind caught up. The animal staggered, swung its huge head, smashed into a spruce that cracked under the impact, and went to its knees in the snow. He watched it. It did not get up. The forest was very quiet when it was over, except for the wind, which did not know anything had happened and continued to scream through the trees regardless. Murbul walked to the animal's side and stood looking down at it for a long time. Then she reached down and touched its broad head with her open hand just briefly, the way someone acknowledges something that costs something. "Well done," Elijah said. His voice was rougher than he intended. She looked up at him. The dawn was coming properly now, gray and bleak through the trees, and the snow had not stopped, but it had eased. Her face was weathered with cold and exertion, her braid half undone, a smear of something across her cheek. "Your noise was very effective," she said. "I was genuinely terrified. That probably helped." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, a full, unguarded sound, brief but real, and it transformed her face entirely. He felt it land somewhere in his chest. "Come," she said. "We need to get back before someone decides we are casualties." They were halfway back through the tree line, moving parallel to the forest edge toward the town's east wall, when the snow truly closed in. The brief easing was over, and the blizzard returned with doubled intensity, and the temperature plummeted in the way it does in mountain country when the storm finds its second wind. "Murbul," who had been moving efficiently since they left the creek bed, faltered. She would not have admitted it if he hadn't been watching carefully. The falter was small, a half-step that corrected itself immediately, but her lips had gone from green to an alarming gray-tinged pale, and her hands on the bow were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the recent fight and everything to do with the cold. He had spent 90 minutes out here. She had spent the better part of 2 days in it with one night in the open. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. What? Without a word, Elijah Weston pulled his heavy woolen campaign cloak from his own shoulders. He had a layered vest and a leather jerkin, and he would be cold but survivable, and stepped behind her and pressed the cloak around her shoulders, folding it closed at her chest with both hands. She went completely still. He had expected her to argue, to pull away. The quiet was unexpected. He stepped around to her front and looked at her face. She was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read. Surprise was part of it, and wariness, and beneath both of those something that was raw and unguarded and very carefully controlled. "You'll freeze," she said. "I'm wearing more layers than you, and I haven't spent 2 days out here." He tugged the cloak's collar up around her neck. His hands were very close to her jaw. He didn't move them immediately. "The town is another half-mile. We're going to walk quickly." "I don't need Murbul." He met her eyes. "Let me do this one thing." She held his gaze. The wind screamed around them, and the snow came, and the light was cold and blue. She pulled the cloak tighter around her own shoulders with one hand. "One thing," she said. They walked the last half-mile fast, and Elijah was cold, genuinely, bone-searingly cold by the time the east gate swung open for them. But he did not regret it for a single step. Inside the gate, in the narrow corridor of the sally port before the inner door opened, the warmth hit them both. Murbul exhaled, a long, shaking breath that she let out all at once as if she'd been holding it for hours. She did not take the cloak off. They were immediately surrounded by questions, by Forel and by 2 of the militia, and by Sella from the Copperbell, who had brought broth in a covered pot, and by Mayor Dunvane, who had apparently been up all night, because her gray hair was unsettled, and her eyes had the hard, bright focus of someone running on nothing but determination. Murbul answered the questions with precise efficiency. The graymaw was dead, the location, the arrows used, the condition of the carcass. She was professional and clear, and gave no indication that she had nearly gone under from cold exposure 30 minutes ago. She still had Elijah's cloak on her shoulders. He watched the mayor's face as Murbul spoke, and he watched the faces of Forel's militia, and he saw the specific recalibration happening behind their eyes, the moment when someone who has come in as a category becomes a person. It was visible and human and not always pretty, because it implied they hadn't managed it before. But it was happening. "The graymaw being in the forest actually works for us now," Elijah said when Murbul finished her account. He addressed Dunvane directly. "If we can get word to Vane that the thing that's been killing his pickets is still out there, keep that fear active. It gives his men a second reason to want to be somewhere else. His supply lines from the east are already stretched because of the weather. He didn't plan for a siege that lasted through a full blizzard." "How do we get word to Vane's men?" Forel asked. "You don't," Murbul said. She reached inside the cloak, inside her leather vest, and drew out a slender case of oiled canvas, sealed with 2 brass catches. She set it on the table in front of the mayor. "The compact holds a contract of commercial mediation with 3 of the eastern barons who hired Vane. I am the compact's authorized assessor. I can invoke the mediation clause, which triggers a mandatory negotiation period, during which hostilities are contractually suspended." She paused. "The barons don't want a prolonged winter siege any more than you do. They hired Vane to make a point, not to lose men to a monster in a blizzard. Give me a messenger flag and a counterpart, and I can end this in 3 days." The silence in the Copperbell was absolute. Aldous Dunvane looked at the document case. She looked at Murbul. She looked at Elijah with an expression that said, "Where did you find this woman?" Elijah spread his hands. He had no answer. The blizzard had found her, or she had found him. The mayor picked up the document case and said, What do you need? What followed was not simple, because nothing in a town under siege in a blizzard with a nervous gate captain and 17 competing interests was ever simple. But Murbul was a professional in a discipline that existed precisely to navigate competing interests under pressure, and watching her work was something Elijah found unexpectedly absorbing. She set up her working space at the Copperbell's back table, and spent the rest of that day drafting correspondence with a careful hand, referencing documents from the canvas case that turned out to contain not just her authorization papers, but copies of 2 of the 3 original Baron contracts with enough margin notes and clauses highlighted to make clear she had read them very carefully and had anticipated this moment. Elijah brought her meals. He was aware this was a somewhat domestic impulse for someone who was supposedly the town's defense advisor, but the alternative was standing at the wall watching Vane's campfires through the snow, and he preferred to be in the room where Murbul was working. On the second evening, she looked up from her papers and found him watching her. "You keep doing that," she said. "Doing what?" "Looking at me as though you're trying to work something out." He considered denying it. "I'm trying to work out how someone who clearly has a good career and a functional life ends up walking alone through a graymaw-haunted forest in a blizzard toward a besieged town." She was quiet for a moment. "The route should have been clear. I had reports from 2 different sources saying Vane's army was 10 days away from Harrowfen. The reports were wrong." She turned her quill in her fingers. "And I prefer to travel alone. People slow down and require conversation. You've been talking to me for 2 days." "You are an exception," she said, and then seemed to consider whether she had said too much and returned to her documents. He went to sleep that night feeling warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. On the morning of the 3rd day, which dawned cold and clear, the blizzard having blown itself out overnight, Murbul sent her letter under a white flag through the east gate, not toward Vane's camp directly, but in the hands of a compact courier who appeared from the direction of the main road with impressive timing, apparently having been sent for 2 days ago by a message Murbul had somehow dispatched before she arrived in Harrowfen at all. "You planned this before you even made it through the gate," Elijah said. "I planned contingencies," she said. "This is one of them. Were there others?" "One involved the graymaw still being alive and somewhat controllable, which I was less confident about. You and the arrows made that one unnecessary." He stared at her. She looked faintly pleased with herself. "I did not become an authorized assessor by being unprepared." The response from the Baron's representative came in 6 hours, which in diplomatic terms was effectively instantaneous evidence of how cold and tired and spooked by the graymaw stories Vane's men actually were. It was a preliminary agreement to invoke the mediation clause. Hostilities were suspended pending formal negotiation. Vane's camp, viewed from Harrowfen's eastern wall in the clear winter afternoon, began the slow process of pulling back to the established neutral zone that the contract specified. Elijah stood on the wall and watched this happen. He had his elbows on the parapet and his breath clouded in front of him, and the world was white and cold and enormously silent after the days of blizzard. Murbul came and stood beside him without announcing herself. She simply appeared at his shoulder, and he moved slightly to give her room, and they stood together watching the distant movement of tents being struck. "It's working," he said. "It will hold," she said. The barons were never truly committed to a winter siege. Vane is a mercenary instrument, not a policy. Remove the policy support and the instrument has no one paying for fuel. "You're very good at what you do." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said simply. "I have had to be." He thought about that. About what it cost, probably, to be an orc woman in a role like hers, navigating human institutions with human rules written, without her kind in mind, carrying credentials into rooms that didn't want to see her there, being good enough that they couldn't ignore her, and having to maintain that standard without a single slip. It was a kind of exhausting he recognized in a different key. He had been the poorest young man in any sellsword company he'd ever joined, the one who had to be twice as reliable to be seen as half as valuable. "I know that specific kind of good," he said. She turned her head and looked at him with the full, unguarded attention she sometimes gave him, and that he was beginning to understand was not something she gave easily. "Yes," she said. "I thought you might." The formal mediation took 2 more days, conducted in a neutral pavilion erected in the snow between the town wall and the pulled-back edge of what remained of Vane's diminished presence. Murbul ran the proceedings with the focused precision of someone in their natural element. She sat across from 2 men who were Vane's representatives, large, well-armed, with the dismissive confidence of those accustomed to getting what they wanted through the implicit threat of what they could do. Elijah sat on Harrowfen's side as the mayor's witness. His job was to be present and, if necessary, not to blink. He watched the moment when one of Vane's men, a broad-necked individual named Sergeant Cray, leaned forward and said with a thin smile, "The compact's assessor. Never seen the compact send a greenskin before." He paused for effect. "Is this a joke?" The room was very still. Elijah did not move. Murbul did not move. Elijah watched her hands, which were flat on the table, still, and he watched her face, which was perfectly composed. "Sergeant Cray," she said, in a voice that was quiet and absolutely controlled, "the documents before you were drafted under Article 14 of the Eastern Commerce Compact, ratified by charter and signed by the Treasurer General in Dawnmark City, whose signet ring you can see on the seal at the bottom of page 3. She let a pause fall. "Article 14 does not specify what the assessor has to look like. It specifies what they have to be legally competent to do. I am legally competent to do it. If you would like to contest that in a charter court, the nearest one is 40 miles east, past Vane's current position, through the remaining snow. Alternatively, you could read page 3. Cray's jaw worked. He picked up the document. He read page 3. He signed. Outside the pavilion, in the cold and the late afternoon light, Murbul stood for a moment breathing the air, and Elijah came up beside her. Without thinking about it, he put his hand briefly on the back of hers, just a touch, a recognition of what she'd done in there. She turned her hand over and held his for a moment before releasing it. "Thank you," she said, "for not saying anything. You didn't need me to say anything." "No, but it mattered that you were there." He felt that in the center of his chest, deep and specific. The agreement was sealed that evening. Vane's army would pull completely clear of Harrowfen territory within 5 days, withdrawing to the Eastern Barrens lands pending a full commercial review that the compact would oversee. It was not a defeat for Vane mercenaries, rarely dealt in ideological defeats, but it was an ending, and it was comprehensive. And when the news was read aloud in the Copperbell that night, the room erupted in sound. Harrowfen's people were laughing and crying and embracing each other, and Forel was shaking hands with everyone in reach, including, eventually, with obvious effort, Murbul, who accepted this with a composure that he suspected concealed complicated feelings. Elijah watched her across the room. She was still wearing his cloak. She had been wearing it since he'd pressed it around her shoulders in the blizzard. It was enormous on her. The cloak was sized for a tall man, and she was tall, but the proportions were different, and it fell to her calves, and she had rolled the sleeves back. She had not offered it back, and he had not asked for it, and they had both simply not addressed it, like a fact they were both aware of but had agreed to leave in the peripheral vision for now. He moved through the celebrating room and arrived at her side. She was watching the room with an expression that was not quite sad but was something adjacent, the particular look of someone who is glad for others and simultaneously aware of being outside the specific joy. "Come on," he said. "Where?" "Somewhere with fewer people." She looked at him for a moment. Then she came. The town had a small square at its center, surrounded by buildings on 3 sides and the market well on the 4th. At night it was empty, and the sky above it was clear for the first time in days, genuinely, luminously clear, with a river of stars across the black from horizon to horizon. They stood in the square and looked up. "When I was young," Murbul said, My father used to take me out of the war tents at night to look at the stars. He said it was important to remember the world was larger than whatever was immediately frightening. What was frightening? At the time, our clan was in the middle of a territorial dispute with the Highland humans over the Spinepass grazing rights. There was intermittent fighting. I was 8. She paused. The same Spinepass I just came through. Did it resolve? Eventually, not cleanly, she looked down from the sky. It never resolves cleanly. There is always something left over. Something left over isn't the same as something never ending, Elijah said. She turned to look at him. In the starlight and the reflected snowglow, her face was silver and green and entirely beautiful in a way he was no longer trying to not notice. You are an unusual man, Elijah Weston, she said. Former sellsword, apple orchardist, not particularly remarkable. You got me through the gate, she said. You held the line in the forest without flinching. You put your cloak on my shoulders in a blizzard without being asked and without requiring thanks. And in that pavilion today you sat completely still next to me while someone said something ugly, and you let me handle it because you understood I needed to. She held his gaze. That is a specific and unusual combination. He said nothing for a moment. The cold was present but bearable. The stars moved infinitesimally. You didn't flinch either, he said, at anything. I am accustomed to being tested. You shouldn't have to be. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not the controlled public face, not the assessor's precision. The guarded heart, opening very slightly, like a door cracked to see what was outside before committing to it. No, she said softly. I shouldn't. He reached out and took her hand properly, both of his around hers, and she let him, and they stood in the square under the stars, and something was decided between them without words, which was the right way for it to be decided. Then she leaned forward and kissed him. Not tentative. She was not a tentative person. Decided and warm and deliberate, her free hand coming up to the back of his jaw, and he kissed her back with everything he had, which was not inconsiderable, and the night was cold and the stars were infinite, and neither of them pulled back for a long time. When they did, she pressed her forehead against his. I wanted to do that in the forest, she said. When you were telling me the town was another half-mile and your lips were going blue, he laughed short and genuine. My lips were going blue because I gave you my cloak, a fact which I am aware of. Are you going to give it back? She pulled back slightly to look at him. Her hand was still at his jaw. No, she said. He smiled. Good. They stood together in the square for a while longer, and the cold was nothing. And the situation that had been desperate 3 days ago was now resolved, and the future was entirely undecided, and Elijah Weston felt, for the first time in years, that undecided was not the same as empty. The morning was busy, as mornings after crises tend to be. Harrowfen's people were already thinking past the immediate reprieve. What would the negotiation mean long-term? How would the grain surplus be managed? What were the compact's next steps? When would Vane's men complete their withdrawal? Murbul was at the center of most of these conversations, whether she wanted to be or not, because she was the person who actually understood the documents, and understanding the documents made you suddenly very popular in a town that had been ignoring you 24 hours before. She handled it with grace and without apparent resentment, which Elijah thought was more generosity than most people would have managed. He stayed near without hovering. He had learned quickly that she disliked hovering and made himself useful in practical ways, bringing food, running messages, and once stepping into a difficult conversation with Forel that she clearly found more tedious than threatening. In the mid-morning, however, he received a visitor he had not expected. The man arrived through the main gate during the brief window. It was opened for a supply wagon, and he walked directly to the copper bell and sat down across from Elijah as though they had an appointment. He was perhaps 50, with a close-trimmed dark beard going gray at the corners, and the bearing of someone used to being the most significant person in a room. He wore a travel cloak with the insignia of the Charter Warden's office, the authority that governed cross-border commerce law in this part of the region, and he carried a leather satchel and an expression of polite, practiced neutrality that Elijah recognized as the face of someone who was here to cause a problem for someone. Elijah Weston. The man said, "Yes, I am Assessor Second Hartley Bruges, Charter Warden's Eastern Office." He set the satchel on the table and opened it without hurry. "You may have heard of me. I haven't." "That's fine. I'm here on a matter of professional verification." He drew out a folder. "There has been an irregularity flagged regarding the mediating assessor's authorization, some question of jurisdictional scope. I'll need to review the compact documents and speak with." He glanced at a note. "Murbul Ironhide, the named assessor." Something cold moved through Elijah's chest that was entirely unrelated to the weather. "What kind of irregularity?" he said. "A jurisdictional one, as I said." Bruges smiled without warmth. "Standard process. If the authorization was in order, there will be nothing to discuss." Murbul was at the back table. She looked up as Bruges crossed the room, and Elijah watched her face read the Charter Warden insignia and compose itself completely flat in a fraction of a second. She closed the document she had been reviewing. "Assessor Second Bruges," she said. "I wasn't informed you were coming." "Informal visit," Bruges said, sitting across from her uninvited. The speed at which the mediation was concluded and the scope of the outcome attracted attention. "We like to review high-impact resolutions." "Review them with the authorized assessor who conducted them," Murbul said, "which is what I am." "Yes, about that." Bruges opened his folder. "Your authorization was issued by Director Amara Vess of the Eastern Compact Office. Director Vess was suspended from authority 6 weeks ago pending a governance review, which means any authorizations she issued after the suspension date are under scrutiny." He placed a document on the table. "Including yours." Murbul looked at the document. She did not touch it. Her hands were flat on the table. Elijah had come to stand at the end of the table. He watched Murbul's face, and it was telling him things that Bruges was probably not trained to read. The slight tightening at the corner of her jaw, the absolutely controlled stillness that, in a less skilled observer, would have been visible tension. "Director Vess's suspension," Murbul said carefully, "was not communicated to active assessors." "Standard protocol," Bruges said. "You should have been monitoring the governance register." "The governance register is updated in Dawnmark City. I have been traveling a field assignment for 3 weeks through disputed territory in a blizzard." She kept her voice level. "I was not in a position to check the capital city register." "Unfortunate," Bruges said. He did not look like he found it unfortunate. "The mediation outcome stands regardless," Murbul said. "The documents were executed. The parties signed. The contractual clause was correctly invoked. A question about the issuing authority of one assessor does not void a fully executed bilateral agreement. It may void it as a compact recognized mediation, which affects enforcement." Bruges folded his hands. "Without compact recognition, the agreement is a private document of uncertain legal standing." The implications of this unfolded in the Copperbell like smoke from a bad fire. If the mediation wasn't compact recognized, Vane could argue the withdrawal agreement wasn't binding. The barons could disclaim it. The siege could resume, or something like it could. Elijah looked at Bruges. He had been watching the man's hands and eyes since he sat down, and he had been a sellsword long enough to know a professional from an amateur and a predetermined outcome from an actual inquiry. "You came through the gate during a supply window," Elijah said, "which means you knew the gate would be open at that specific time, which means someone inside the wall told you when it would be." Bruges looked at him with mild interest, as if he were a moderately clever dog. "I don't see how my arrival is relevant." "It's relevant because you're not here to review a jurisdictional irregularity in good faith. You're here because someone connected to Vane's network found a procedural angle after the agreement was signed and sent you to use it." Elijah kept his voice even. "Who engaged you? Sergeant Cray? Or was it higher than that, one of the Baron's people directly?" Bruges said nothing, but the nothing had a texture. Murbul's hand moved under the table. Elijah could see it from where he stood. She was drawing out something from the flat inner pocket of her vest, not a weapon, something paper, folded small. She set it on the table and opened it. Director Vess's suspension, she said, was initiated on the 14th day of last month. My authorization was issued on the 11th. She turned the paper to face Bruges. This is the date-certified receipt of my authorization from the Eastern Office, witnessed by 3 staff members and sealed with the office mark. She placed her finger on the date. 3 days before the suspension, which means my authorization predates it and is not subject to its effects. She held Bruges' gaze. I am aware that the governance register is updated with a 5-day lag. Director Amara Vess knew this when she was informed of the incoming suspension. She date-certified every outstanding assessor authorization before it took effect, because she is thorough. A pause. I am also thorough. I have carried this document since I left the Eastern Office. I expected someone to try this. The room had gone very quiet. Bruges looked at the document. He was doing the calculation, the date, the witness seals, the office mark. His expression did not change, but something behind it rearranged. This will need to be verified, he said. Verify it, Murbul said. The witnesses are on record. The Eastern Office registry has the original. You can reach it in 4 days on the Northern Road. She let a pause fall. Or you could acknowledge that the mediation stands as executed, sign the review form in your satchel noting no irregularity found, and be back in your office before the end of the week. Bruges looked at the form in his satchel. He looked at the date-certified document. He looked at Murbul. He picked up his pen. When he left 20 minutes later, Elijah walked him to the gate personally. Not to escort him out of courtesy, but because he wanted to make sure he actually left, and because the walk gave him a moment to say, quietly and without heat, if Vane's people try a second approach, through whatever other channel you or they might know, I'll find out. And I will make enough noise about a charter warden being used as a commercial weapon that the review they'll be answering to will make the governance inquiry on Director Vess look trivial. Bruges looked at him. I'm an apple orchardist now, Elijah said. I have absolutely nothing to lose. He walked back to the copper bell and found Murbul at the back table with the date-certified document still in her hand, looking at it, and when she looked up at him her face was open, not the controlled public face. Something behind it. He told the truth, she said. He was sent. Yes, and you saw it before I did. You were focused on the documents. I was watching him. She looked at him for a moment. Then she set the document down and said, Elijah, come here. He went around the table and she stood and she put both hands on the sides of his face and kissed him with a directness and depth that left no ambiguity about anything, right there in the copper bell with Sella pretending to wipe the counter 20 feet away. When she pulled back, she kept her hands on his face for a moment. I need you to know, she said quietly, that I have been managing alone for a long time. I am not, she paused, searching for the word with unusual care. I do not do this easily, any of this, the being near someone, the trusting. I know, he said. I have not known you long enough for this to be simple, she said. No. And yet, she looked at him with those amber eyes, direct and unguarded. And yet, he agreed. She let go of his face and sat back down and picked up her document and was the compact's assessor again. But she reached across and put her hand over his where it rested on the table edge and kept it there while she worked. Vane's withdrawal was confirmed and completed on the 5th day, as the agreement specified. The last of his mercenary column moved off the visible horizon in the early afternoon with the sun low and orange behind them, and Harrowfen's people came out onto the wall to watch them go, which Elijah thought was not quite wise but was deeply understandable. Murbul stood on the wall and watched with him. The Greymaw helped, she said. It really did. 3 soldiers' deaths attributed to it and rumors of more. Mercenaries don't like dying for unclear reasons. Vane's men were already unsettled. She paused. We inadvertently made the better situation by dealing with the beast. Inadvertently. We planned that hunt specifically. I planned it for the town's safety, she said. The effect on the siege was adjacent. He looked at her profile. The winter afternoon light turned the planes of her face amber and copper. She was magnificent in this light and in every other light he had seen her in, and he was aware that he was past the point of trying to be measured about this. "What happens now?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon where Vane's column had been. "I need to file my resolution report. Return to the Eastern Compact office. The governance review of Director Vess's situation will need assessor testimony." She paused. "After that, my schedule is undefined for the first time in some years." "Where's the Eastern Compact office?" "Thornville, about 40 miles northeast. That's 20 miles from my orchard." She turned her head to look at him. "Is it?" "Yes, which is not a coincidence that I'm pointing out. I'm pointing it out." She held his gaze. "I noticed. The orchard runs itself fairly well from late autumn through early spring. I could take a month or two away from it without the apple trees suffering significantly." "And what would you do with a month or two?" she asked, and the amber eyes were warm now, the way they got when she was going to say something that mattered and was preparing for it. "Help you file a report," he said. "Navigate a governance review. Stand next to you in rooms that don't want to see you there." He paused. "Tell you things about apple trees that will probably bore you, but I will attempt to make interesting." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind came off the wall's edge and pushed her braid across her shoulder. She was still wearing his cloak. "I want that," she said softly. It sounded like it cost her something to say it plainly like that. "I want all of that. Then we have a plan." "A loose plan," she said. "Plans tighten as you follow them." She put her arm through his, and they stood on the wall as Harrowfen breathed its relief into the cold afternoon air below them. And the horizon was clear, and the road northeast was free. That evening, Mayor Dunvane held a gathering in the Copperbell that was not quite a celebration, and not quite a formal occasion, but landed somewhere between the two in the way that small towns do their best moments. People crowded together with their best clothes and second-best manners. The fire enormous, Sella having produced some reserve bottles of something amber from a locked cabinet, and every table pushed back to make room for the population of Harrowfen, or most of it, in one place. Aldous Dunvane made a speech. She thanked the townspeople. She thanked the militia. She made specific and generous mention of Elijah Weston, which made him deeply uncomfortable in the exact way that public thanks always made him uncomfortable, because he felt he had done only what was available to be done and did not require applause for it. Then she turned to Murbul and said, "And to Assessor Ironhide, who arrived at our gate in a blizzard with an arrow and a document case, and ended a siege that we could not have broken alone on behalf of Harrowfen, and in full acknowledgement of what our town charter unfortunately has said and has continued to say for 40 years. She stopped for a moment, and her voice when she continued was direct and without ceremony. "You are welcome here. You were always welcome here. We failed to say it and we failed to show it, and I am sorry for that. The charter will be revised." She raised her cup. "To Murbul Ironhide." The room was quiet for just a moment. Then Forel's voice from the back said, in a tone that suggested he was surprising himself, "To Murbul Ironhide." And then it was everyone, and it was loud. Murbul stood with the amber bottle in her hand and her back very straight and her face composed, and Elijah was close enough to see the precise moment when the composure wavered just briefly, a single crack across it, quickly sealed. He leaned slightly into her side, shoulder to shoulder, and she leaned back, and it was enough. After the gathering wound down, they found themselves on the town wall again. It seemed to be their place, the wall, the open air, and the stars. The night was cold but still, the blizzard truly finished. The fields beyond Harrowfen were blue-white and unbroken, the forest dark and quiet, the sky enormous. "She meant it," Elijah said. "I know she did," Murbul said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am not accustomed to that. The meaning it part, the saying it in public part." She turned her cup in her hands. "Most of the time someone has valued the work I do, it has been in private, in writing, at a distance. Never," she gestured slightly toward the Copperbell below, "never like that. You should be angrier about that than you are." "I am angry," she said simply. "I have just learned not to let the anger be the first thing I am. It is too expensive." She paused. "The work costs enough. The anger costs too much on top." He thought about that carefully, turning it over. I want things to cost you less, he said finally. She looked at him. He felt her looking, the specific quality of it, serious and warm at the same time. That is a large thing to want for someone you have known 5 days, she said. I know. And yet you said it. I did. She reached out and took his hand in the dark. Her hand was larger than his and warmer, which she would always be, and he liked this as a fact about the world. The cloak, she said after a moment. What about it? I want to explain why I kept it, she said, since neither of us has addressed it. You don't have to explain it. I want to. She was looking out at the dark fields. When you pressed it around my shoulders in the blizzard, I was past the point where I would have admitted how cold I was. I would have made the half-mile. But she paused. I was at the edge of what I would call composed, and you did it without asking me whether I needed it. Not because you thought I couldn't manage, but because you could see I was managing and you wanted to make it easier anyway. She turned her head to look at him. No one has done that in a long time, perhaps ever in that exact way. He was very still. So I didn't take it off, she said, because I wanted to keep the feeling of it. Of being seen and having someone do something about it without requiring me to ask. Murbul, yes. That's what I want it to always be like, he said. Between us. That's the thing I'm describing when I say I want things to cost you less. She looked at him for a long moment. The stars and the snowlight made everything luminous and very quiet. Then she let go of his hand, took the cloak from her own shoulders with a deliberate motion, and draped it over both of them together, her arm going around him, pulling him into her side, the cloak wrapping them both against the cold. There, she said. Now it costs neither of us. He put his arm around her waist, and she was warm and solid and real, and the night was cold and the world was enormous, and neither of those things mattered at all. In the days that followed, with the siege broken and the documents filed and Vane's column a memory on the road, Harrowfen began to breathe normally again. Supplies were rationed out of the siege stores. The gate stood open in the daylight. People went back to their trades, their arguments, their ordinary lives, which is the most profound gift that the ending of an emergency provides, the return of the ordinary. Elijah and Murbul moved through these days with the easy proximity of two people who have stopped pretending they are not drawn to each other. She continued her work at the back table of the Copper Bell. The governance report for Director Vess's situation was extensive and required precision, and he ranged through the town doing the kinds of useful things that needed doing. Helping patch a section of wall damaged by the accumulated ice, splitting firewood for the houses that had run low during the blizzard, sitting with Mayor Dunvane and Forel to give account of the Greymaw hunt, so they could brief whatever hunters would need to go into the forest eventually for the carcass. Evenings were theirs. They developed habits with the speed that people do when they have found someone who fits, as if the habits had been waiting to be inhabited. They ate together late, after the Copper Bell's busiest hours, at the corner table that had become understood as theirs. They walked the wall. They talked about the compact, about the clan territories she had grown up in, about the orchards, about the years he'd spent as a sellsword, which he talked about less naturally than she did about her childhood because there was more in those years that he was not proud of. You stopped, she said one evening when he went quiet after describing a campaign that had gone badly in ways that were partly his fault. When the work stopped being what you thought it was. When I was 28, he said, a contract went wrong, someone got hurt who shouldn't have. I walked away and found the orchard 6 months later, and that was that. Do you miss it? The blade work? No, he thought about it. The company sometimes, the clarity of knowing what you're doing and why. You seem clear to me, she said. Lately, he agreed. He looked at her. She reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair back from his forehead, a small, proprietorial gesture utterly natural from her, and it made something in him quiet and glad. Tell me about the orchard, she said. He did. He described the rows of trees in spring when the blossoms came, the specific way light moved through the branches in late afternoon. The way the apples sorted themselves by color as you looked down the rows from the high end of the slope. The sounds of it, wind and bees, and the particular soft percussion of ripe fruit dropping. She listened with complete attention, which he was learning was one of the things she did when something interested her, and it was one of the things he most valued in anyone. "I would like to see it," she said when he stopped. "It's not dramatic," he said, "not like anything you've dealt with this week." "I don't need dramatic," she said. "I would like to see the thing that gives you the look you have when you describe it." "What look?" "The one that's there right now," she said. "Like your home even when you're talking about it from 40 miles away." He was quiet. "Come see it," he said, "when the snow breaks in spring." "Before spring," she said. He looked at her. Her eyes were direct, sure. "I'm going to Thornville to file the report," she said. "The Eastern Compact Office, which is 20 miles from your orchard." She paused deliberately. "I would be a fool not to stop." "You would," he agreed. "And I am not a fool." "No," he said, "you are absolutely not." The night she came to him was quiet and unhurried and felt like something that had been decided not in that moment but in the blizzard, in the forest, at the gate, in the square under the stars. She came to the room he had in the Copperbell's upper floor. The town had given it to him for the duration and knocked, which was a formality she observed not because she was uncertain but because she believed in acknowledging choices with full deliberateness. He opened the door and looked at her. She looked back. "I am here," she said, which was both obvious and not obvious at all. "I see that," he said, and stepped back to let her in. What followed was warm and private and deeply, genuinely theirs. The first time, and not like a first time at all, more like a return to something they had always been close to. She was as direct in this as in everything, knowing what she wanted and reaching for it without apology. And he was glad to be reached for in a way that he had not expected to be glad about anything again. She was powerful and warm, and she was Murbul, specifically and entirely. And when she looked at him in the close dark, he felt seen in the exact way she had described wanting to see, all the way through, without omission. He woke in the early morning with her arm across his chest and her breathing slow and even beside him, and lay in the dark, looking at the ceiling, and felt something enormous and simple that he had stopped expecting. Afterward, in the soft gray of actual dawn, she was sitting up with his cloak around her shoulders, back on her shoulders, where she'd retrieved it from the chair at the foot of the bed, reading one of her documents by the thin winter light from the window. He watched her from the pillow, and she became aware of it after a moment and looked at him. "You do not need to look at me like that," she said, but her mouth curved. "Like what?" "Like I am something remarkable." "You are something remarkable." "I am reading a governance report." "Remarkably," he said. She threw a boot at him gently. He caught it and put it on the floor, and they looked at each other across the small, cold room in the winter morning light. And it was so ordinary and so extraordinary at the same time that he felt it as a physical thing. He sat up. "Murbul, I want you to know something." He waited until she had set the document down. "I am not saying this because of last night, and I am not saying it because of the week or the siege or any particular moment. I am saying it because it is true, and I have been aware of it being true for several days now, and I think it deserves to be said plainly." She was looking at him with full attention. "I love you," he said. "I know it's fast and I know it's a lot, and I'm not asking you to match it on a schedule, but it's true and you should know it." The silence lasted long enough that he became genuinely uncertain about what was happening in it. Then Murbul said, quietly and with the care of someone choosing each word with intention, "Elijah Weston, I walked into a besieged town through a blizzard with a graymaw on my trail and an arrow in my bow, and I genuinely expected nothing from it except survival." She paused. "You were an entirely unexpected development." He waited. "I am not accustomed to being loved," she said. "I am accustomed to being respected professionally, feared occasionally, and occasionally desired. I am not accustomed to being," she stopped, "seen, the way I have said, and chosen, for what I am, not what I can do." She held his gaze. "But I am there with you. Wherever there is, I am there." "That's enough," he said. "That's exactly enough." She moved the document case to the floor and lay back down beside him. the cloak still around her shoulders and now around both of them. And the morning was cold, and the light was coming, and there was nothing urgent left that required them to be anywhere else immediately. The resolution came fully a week after the siege's end, on the day the compact's official courier arrived with the governance review decision. Director Amara Vess was fully reinstated, the procedural suspension having been found to have been initiated on misrepresented grounds. Murbul read this document twice, set it down, pressed her fist to the table once, and then sat quietly for a moment. Elijah, across the table, watched her. "She's all right," he said. "She is all right," Murbul agreed. Her voice was level, but her eyes were warm. "She was the one who believed in my work when I was first starting. She gave me the first real assessment assignment. When the suspension came through, she paused. "I was not calm about it. You hid it well. I did not have time to be otherwise. She'd be proud of this resolution," he said. Murbul looked at the document for a moment. "Yes," she said, "she would." With Vess reinstated, the mediation agreement's compact recognition was fully secured, eliminating any remaining legal ambiguity about its enforcement. The Baron's withdrawal obligation was ironclad. Vane was contractually bound by penalties that would cost the Eastern Barons significantly if they attempted to breach. Harrowfen was safe, genuinely, structurally safe, and the outcome had been accomplished not by an army or a miracle but by one orc woman with a document case, a date-certified authorization, and an orchardist who knew how to hold a line. Mayor Dunvane, upon receiving the confirming documents, called Murbul and Elijah to her office, which was a small stone room behind the market hall that smelled of ink and lamp oil. She sat behind her desk and looked at them both for a moment, and then she said, "What do you need to do now?" It was directed at Murbul. "I need to go to Thornville," Murbul said. "File the resolution report in person. Speak with Director Vess." After that, she glanced at Elijah briefly. "After that, I have significant flexibility for the first time in years." Aldous Dunvane looked at them both with the calm of someone who has seen many things in many years and knows how to read the ones that matter. She said, "I am going to write a letter of formal commendation for both of you to the Charter Warden's office and to the Compact. Not because you need it," she paused, "but because it should be on record who solved this problem and how." "Thank you," Murbul said. "Don't thank me, I'm correcting an imbalance." Dunvane picked up her pen. "Go, be somewhere useful to yourselves." They left Harrowfen on a morning that was cold and clear and alive, the road hard-packed with frozen snow and the sky a sharp, brilliant blue. Murbul had her canvas case on her back and her bow over her shoulder and her quiver full and her document satchel across one hip. She had folded Elijah's cloak neatly and offered it back as they stood at the gate. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "Keep it." She held his gaze. "It's your cloak. You've been wearing it for a week. It's yours." She looked down at it in her hands. Then she swung it around her own shoulders with the practiced motion of someone reclaiming something they'd already decided was theirs, and fastened the throat clasp. "Yours," she said quietly, but she was not talking about the cloak. He picked up his pack. "Mine," he agreed, and they walked out through the gate into the open road. The road from Harrowfen to Thornville was 40 miles of frozen highland track, threading through the lower ranges and cutting across 2 river fords and a stretch of open moorland that was breathtaking under the winter sky, mile after mile of blue-white emptiness with the mountains in the northeast, like teeth against the horizon. They walked most of it, with one night at a waypost inn that was small and low-ceilinged and warm. They talked as they walked, without the urgency of crisis driving them, and it was a different kind of talking, longer, slower, more meandering, following threads without needing to resolve them immediately. Murbul talked about the compact structure, about the kind of work she wanted to do as the political climate in the region shifted, about the possibility of establishing a proper orc-integrated trade office in Harrowfen that would make what she had done last week a permanent structure rather than a single emergency resolution. Elijah talked about the orchard, what he wanted to do with the back slope where he tried barley and abandoned it, The idea of a small cider press if he could source the equipment, the way the valley below the property looked in early spring when everything was mud and possibility. "You could do both," he said at one point. "Both what?" "The trade office and the Orchard Valley. Thornville is 20 miles. That's not permanent distance." She looked at him sideways as they walked. "Are you proposing something?" "I'm noting a geographical fact. You are noting it very intentionally." "I am," he said. She was quiet for a stretch of road which he had learned did not mean no, it meant she was thinking, and she was the kind of person whose thinking deserved its space. "I have never stayed anywhere long," she said finally. "I have traveled for work for 7 years. I have an apartment in Thornville that I have spent perhaps 40 collective days in." "You don't have to stay," he said. "You just have to have a place that's yours to come back to. Your orchard." "It could be," he said, "if you wanted it." "If you wanted me." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The moorland was enormous and silent and white all around them, the wind low and steady from the north. "I told you in the morning that I am there with you," she said. "Wherever there is." "You did? Then you already know the answer to the question you're asking very carefully." He turned to face her properly. The winter sky was enormous above her head and the cloak moved in the wind and she was looking at him with the full, unguarded Murbul face. No assessor, no controlled public calm, just her, amber-eyed and direct and completely real. "Yes," he said. "I do." She crossed the last step between them and kissed him there on the open road in the middle of the moorland with the mountains in the distance and the sky huge above them, and it was not tentative and it was not brief, and the wind moved around them and the world was cold and indifferent and entirely beautiful. When she pulled back she put her forehead against his, her hands on the sides of his face. "I have been alone a long time," she said quietly. "I am very tired of it." "I know," he said. "Me too. I want to see the orchard in spring." "You'll see it in spring, and before spring." "And before spring," he agreed. She kissed him again, shorter, decided, a period at the end of a sentence. Then she stepped back and smoothed the cloak and turned back to the road and began walking. He fell into step beside her. They reached Thornville 3 days later. The Eastern Compact office was a stone building 3 stories high on the town's main commercial street, with the Compact's tree and compass seal carved above the door. Director Amara Vess was a compact, dark-complexioned woman in her 60s with bright eyes and a dry smile. And when she received them in her office, she looked at Murbul for a long moment, and then stood and came around the desk and embraced her, which appeared to surprise Murbul entirely. "I heard what you did," Vess said. "I heard all of it. Bruges came here before he went to Harrowfen, and I will tell you that man is no longer employed by the Charter Warden's office." "How?" Murbul said. "Because I wrote the letter that needed to be written, which I should have written 6 weeks ago, and it has now been received." Vess stepped back and looked at her. "You navigated every trap they laid, and you did it in a blizzard under siege with a graymaw in the forest. If I needed any evidence that your authorization was the right call," she spread her hands. Murbul was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for the date certification." "I knew you'd need it," Vess said simply. "I know you." She looked past Murbul at Elijah. "And you are the orchardist," he blinked. "She told you about me." She sent a report via courier from Harrowfen before she left. It was professional and thorough and mentioned you approximately 7 times, which for Murbul Ironhide's reports is unprecedented. Vess smiled. "I am glad you held the line." "She did most of it," he said honestly. "I know, but she is used to doing most of it alone." Vess held his gaze for a moment with the directness of someone who wants to be understood. That is not a small thing to change. They spent 3 days in Thornville while Murbul filed the full resolution report and met with the Compact's senior counsel on the question of a permanent trade office in Harrowfen. The proposal was received well better than Murbul had expected, which she told him with the measured satisfaction of someone who had done the internal political preparation and was watching it work. Elijah moved through Thornville's market and made himself useful in small ways, gathering information about cider press equipment, which turned out to be something Thornville's cooperage district actually stocked, and having a conversation with a merchant there that resulted in a preliminary agreement for equipment on credit terms that he was quietly pleased about. On the last evening in Thornville, they ate at a proper restaurant, a small place near the compact street that had a warm interior and food that did not involve Sella's siege-rationed lentil soup. And it was so ordinary and pleasant that Elijah found himself grinning at nothing across the table. "What?" Murbul asked. "Nothing." He looked at her. This. She looked around the restaurant, the other diners, the candles, the ordinary pleasant evening of it. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said softly, "this." The morning they left Thornville for the orchard, Murbul carried her canvas case and her document satchel, and a small wrapped parcel from the compact's office that turned out to be her permanent appointment as senior assessor for the Highland Regional Division, including the new Harrowfen trade office, a position she had been offered the night before after the council meeting, and had spent the intervening hours considering, and then accepted with characteristic directness and zero visible celebration. Because she was not a person who made a theater of good news, she told Elijah about it on the road. "Senior assessor," he said. "Yes, Highland Regional, which includes Harrowfen. Which means the trade office is formally part of my jurisdiction." She looked at the road ahead. "Which means I will be in the Highlands regularly, including 20 miles from an orchard." "Including that," she said. He reached across and took her hand. She let him and held his, and they walked the 20 miles in the winter morning with the mountains coming closer and the road winding through the frozen lower valley, and the world opening gradually into the specific landscape. He had described to her the long ridgeline to the south, the stand of old oak at the valley's bend, the river crossing that was knee-deep in summer and was currently a ice-rimmed ford. When they crested the last rise and the orchard came into view, the rows of apple trees gray and bare in the winter, the stone farmhouse with its cold chimney, the back slope falling away to the south, Elijah stopped. He had not been back since he'd left for Harrowfen 2 weeks ago, following Mayor Dunvan's rider into a crisis he had not expected. He looked at it now with the specific feeling of the place being both the same and entirely different because of who was standing beside him. Murbul stood at his shoulder looking at the rows of bare trees. "In spring," she said slowly, "when the blossoms come, the whole ridge smells like something from a different world," he said. "Warm and sweet and completely unearned. I want to see it." "You will." She turned to look at him. The winter light was flat and white and kind to nothing, and she was beautiful in it, the strong jaw, the amber eyes, the braid worn down now because it had been a traveling day and she had let it loose, and Elijah's heavy cloak around her shoulders where it had been for 2 weeks now and where, he had decided, it would remain as long as she wanted it. "Yours," he said again, meaning the cloak, meaning the orchard, meaning whatever she wanted of any of it. She stepped to him and put her arms around him, all the way around him, which was new, which she had not done in the open like this, and held him with the unhurried strength of someone who has stopped being in a hurry. He held her back. The orchard was cold and dormant around them, and the road that had brought them here stretched away into the highlands, and everything behind them was resolved, truly resolved. The siege ended, the documents filed, the governance restored, Bruges gone, Vane retreated, the greymoss still and quiet in the forest, Harrowfen safe. Nothing was chasing them. Nothing required anything of them in this specific moment. He felt her exhale against his shoulder, the same long, slow breath she'd let out in the sally port when the warmth hit them after the blizzard, the breath of something released. "Come inside," he said. "The fire takes about 10 minutes to catch properly. I'll make tea." She pulled back slightly and looked at his face. "You know how to make tea." "I live alone. I had to learn to do things." "I also live alone," she said. "I do not know how to make tea." "Then it's useful that you're here," he said. "It is," she agreed, and the way she said it was not about tea at all. They went inside. The fire caught in 8 minutes, not 10, and the farmhouse was cold in the way that empty stone buildings are cold in winter, deeply, thoroughly, requiring time to warm. But the kitchen hearth threw heat generously, and Elijah moved through the familiar space with the ease of long habit, finding the tin of tea, finding the kettle, filling it from the kitchen pump that had not frozen because he had lagged the pipe properly last autumn. Murbul sat at the kitchen table and watched him with the attentive interest she gave to things she found genuinely engaging, and he moved around the kitchen knowing she was watching and found it did not make him self-conscious. It made him feel instead like himself, like the specific self he had settled into in this house over 3 years of quiet, solitary, purposeful life, and that self was not diminished by her presence but somehow more solid for it, more visible to himself. "The document case you always carry," he said. "The original authorization. Do you still have the receipt? The date-certified one?" "Yes. I'll file it at the Harrowfen trade office." She paused, "along with the establishment documents for the office. I'll need to go back in perhaps 3 weeks. I know someone who could drive you, an orchardist with a cart. He has an excellent cart," she considered. "Does he have a reliable horse?" "He has a large, extremely stubborn horse who goes where he's pointed and not a step faster." "That sounds familiar," she said. He looked at her over the kettle and she was grinning fully, the expression transforming her face the way it had that first time in the forest, and he felt the same thing land in the same place in his chest. "Murbul," he said. "Yes. I meant what I said on the moorland, all of it." She was quiet. "Then I know. Is this going to be—" He stopped, started again. "I want to ask you something without it sounding like pressure. Ask it. Is this going to be your base?" He looked around the kitchen, the stone walls, the fire, the window looking out on the bare orchard. "Not just a stop, not just proximity to a new office. Is this home for you if you want it to be?" She was silent for long enough that the kettle began to steam. "I have not had a home in the sense you mean," she said. "Since the clan territory, since I was a girl." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I have had addresses. I have had adequate rooms. I have had the road." She raised her eyes to his. "I have never had someone who asked me that question. I'm asking it. I know." She stood up from the table and came to where he stood at the hearth, and she took the kettle from his hand and set it aside and put her hands on the sides of his face exactly the way she had in the copper bell after Bruges left, exactly the way she had in the morning in the small room, which he was learning was how she touched him when she was saying something that she wanted to make sure he felt rather than just heard. "Yes," she said. "If you are asking whether this is home, then yes. You are. That makes this home." He turned his head and kissed her palm. She let him. Then she put her forehead against his and they stood at the hearth of the farmhouse while the kettle steamed and the fire caught properly, and the orchard waited in the cold outside, patient and dormant and full of what it would become in spring. "Stay," he said. "I am staying," she said. Not as a final statement of a resolved thing but as an ongoing present tense, which was better, a choice being made continuously, renewed, not sealed once and left. She was staying. The cloak was on the chair by the door where she had hung it when they came in, and she would put it on again when she went out, and it would be there, and she would be there. Outside, the winter held the valley in its cold hand, and the apple trees stood in their patient rows, and the road that had brought them here through the blizzard and the forest and the siege and the moorland curved away through the frozen landscape toward Harrowfen and Thornville and all the places they had been. Behind them the fire caught fully. The room began to warm. They stood together in it, in the warmth, in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of no longer being alone. And that was everything. That was, in the end, the whole thing: the siege broken, the Greymaw dead, the documents filed, the road walked, the fire lit. Two people who had found each other in the worst of conditions, and had, with full deliberateness and open eyes, chosen each other in the good ones. Murbul Ironhide, senior assessor of the Highland Regional Division, who had come through a blizzard with an arrow and a document case, and the backbone of someone who had never once let the world convince her she was less than what she was. Elijah Weston, former sellsword, apple orchardist, ordinary man, who had held the line in the forest and stood still in the pavilion and put his cloak around her shoulders in the blizzard without asking if she needed it, because he could see that she did. She had not taken the cloak off at dawn. She was not going to take it off. And the morning would come, and the spring would come after it, and the blossoms would open in the rows of trees, and the whole ridge would smell like something from another world, and she would be there to smell it. And that was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. That was everything.